All right, welcome back everybody into our next video talking about the maxims of mechanical ventilation. And this really, from a practical standpoint, I think is the quote-unquote money shot of how we actually define what the hell a ventilator is doing. And this really comes down to a concept known as mode and what all goes into a mode. And again, what we're doing is we're building the basic physiological foundation of universal shared terminology of what's going on. And then when you go back and you're interfacing with your facilities or your program's specific ventilator, and there's a mode that says super comfortable, volume limited pressure support adaptive NAVA mode number 7, okay, and that's the trademark name that company gives. What you can do is you can look at that, and then you can look in the manual for the ventilator and go, okay, what does that mode actually do? And you can relate it back to these videos and go, oh, okay, this is what this super duper volume comfortable NAVA pressure mode number 12 is actually doing physiologically, and I can understand what the mode is and when, how, and why I would want to use it, okay? So let's take a dive. All right, so Maxims 6 through 10. All right, so when we talk about defining breaths, mechanical ventilator, breaths are classified in one of a few ways. They are classified as spontaneous, mandatory, or both. So when we say that a patient takes a spontaneous breath, or the ventilator delivers a mandatory breath, or there's a combination of spontaneous and mandatory, the way these are defined are based off of the trigger and cycle events. What is triggering and what is cycling that breath? All right? And so what a ventilator can do is it can deliver 3 primary breath sequences. And these sequences include CMV, IMV, and CSV. So what does that mean? CMV is continuous, mandatory ventilation. Continuous mandatory ventilation, it doesn't matter what the name of the mode is that the company gives it. When we say that a ventilator is delivering CMV, that is that the ventilator is in complete control of the breath. The triggering and the cycling is mandatory and is being done by the ventilator. That's what it means to be in a CMV mode. And there may be a dozen different types of different individual names for a CMV mode, but at the end of the day, if you're super NAVA extra dextra jelly sandwich mode on your ventilator, if it is a mode that causes the ventilator to deliver every single breath as a mandatory breath where the ventilator's in control, that is CMV, okay? The next is what we call IMV, and that stands for intermittent mandatory ventilation. All right, intermittent mandatory ventilation, IMV. And intermittent mandatory ventilation is where there is a minimum mandatory setting the patient must receive, maybe a minimum mandatory rate and a minimum mandatory tidal volume, say, if you're in volume control ventilation. And then on top of that, if the patient wants to take additional spontaneous breaths, and remember, a spontaneous breath is a breath that is triggered and cycled by the patient, right? It may be an assisted breath, right? So you can have an assisted spontaneous breath, but when we say a spontaneous breath, we're saying that A spontaneous breath is a breath that is triggered and cycled by the patient, not the ventilator. So IMV is where there is a combination of mandatory and spontaneous breaths. And so, as you might imagine, CSV is continuous spontaneous ventilation. Continuous spontaneous ventilation. All right. And this is where every breath the patient takes is triggered and cycled by the patient. All right. And so every breath is spontaneous. The breaths are still mechanically ventilated because, again, there has to be an artificial airway in place and the ventilator is delivering positive pressure support, right? Be that maybe in just the form of PEEP or pressure support or an inspiratory and expiratory pressure, bilevel or BiPAP. That doesn't matter. That just means that it is a supported breath. But the fact that the patient is choosing the trigger and cycle events, not the ventilator, that makes it a continuous, spontaneous ventilatory breath sequence. All right? So those are the three primary breath sequences. All right? So if you select, say your ventilator has an SIMV mode, whatever that does at the end of the day, right? We know that SIMV stands for synchronized intermittent mandatory ventilation. We know that the breath sequence of SIMV is going to be IMV. It's literally in the name, right? So we know that much. So that's one part, all right? So one part is classifying the breaths. Are these spontaneous breaths, mandatory breaths, or a combination thereof? And so spontaneous would be CSV, mandatory CMV, and a combination thereof IMV. That's the breath sequence. And then there are 5 different ventilatory patterns that use the breath sequences. All right, so these patterns are going to be based on the control variable. And remember, the control variable is what is being used to control the cycling from inspiration to expiration, right? That's what it means to say control, right? That's one of the 2 variables that we can interface with during inspiration, right? Remember, you've got your control variables and your limit variables. So what we're doing now is we're taking the breath sequence and we're adding onto that the control variable that is being used, all right? And so what you get is you get the first one, which is volume control. So VC equals volume control. So that is to say that volume is the control variable the ventilator is going to use to determine when to cycle out of inspiration and into exhalation. That is to say that once a certain tidal volume is met, then the ventilator can cycle to expiration. So we are controlling volume and the patient is in continuous mandatory ventilation. All right? So the breath sequence is CMV and the control variable is volume. And we call that primary breathing pattern volume controlled, controlled mechanical ventilation. All right, VCCMV. The second one is volume control, IMV here. And then pressure control, CMV. So we now are using pressure as our control variable, and we are in CMV breath sequencing. And then pressure control, IMV. Pressure control is our control variable, so PCCMV. equals pressure control, all right? And IMV is intermittent mandatory ventilation. And then pressure control, CSV, pressure control, or continuous spontaneous ventilation, all right? Those are the 5 primary ventilatory patterns that you get, all right? So you classify your breaths, and that gives you 3 primary breath sequences, and then you add in your control variable that the ventilator is using, and that gives you 5 primary ventilatory patterns. But remember, within these ventilatory patterns, there are a number of limit variables that the ventilator can use. And remember, a limit variable does not determine triggering or cycling. A limit variable is just kind of putting a boundary or a barrier, right? It's saying, hey, you constrain a parameter, but that, remember, the limit variable is not used to determine cycling, okay? That's the control variable. So there are a bunch of limit variables, and so within every pattern, there are many types of modes that can be distinguished by targeting schemes that are mainly using limiting variables. And this is where a lot of the confusion of the names of modes, the trade names that come out, that like, volume control plus and all of these names, and a lot of the complex naming conventions comes down to what types of specific targeting schemes are being used. But at the end of the day, right, regardless of this, at the end of the day, whatever that mode is, what breaths are being delivered, what primary breath sequences are being delivered, and what are the ventilatory patterns. And once you know this, you kind of know, okay, this is what the ventilator is using to cycle. This is the primary breath sequence and ventilatory pattern that it's producing. And now that I understand that fundamentally or foundationally, I can then take a deep dive into, okay, what is this specific mode targeting, okay? And then at the end of the day, you put all this together, and when we talk about the generic name for a mode of ventilation, all right, you classify a mode of ventilation by the control variable, and that is either going to be pressure control or volume control. And like, you can have volume control ventilation, and maybe you can have something like VC plus, where the plus is you are targeting or limiting pressure, right? And so that goes into this here, right, the limit variables. But at the end of the day, it's still volume control, and that is to say that volume is the control variable that is being used to tell the ventilator when to cycle out of inspiration and into exhalation, all right? So a mode of ventilation is classified by its control variable, its breath sequence, and the targeting scheme, all right? And you put all 3 of these together to arrive at what the mode is actually doing, all right? And that is what we're going to talk about in subsequent videos. But at this point, I think we have at least developed the basic foundation and intuition for understanding modes of mechanical ventilation. Hopefully you enjoyed this video, and hopefully things are starting to make sense now. We'll see you in the next one. Take care, everybody.